perfectly fine, perfectly healthy to identify in part by your identity. I don't have a particularly strong Jewish identity, but I identify in part as somebody who's Jewish, and that's in part because of the experiences I had growing up as a Jew in Germany, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think in a deeply diverse society, people always celebrate the kind of cultures they come from, as well as perhaps some amount of forms of ethnic solidarity, and that's just fine. What I do think is troubling is two things. First, that often our institutions now try and encourage people as strongly as possible to identify by those kinds of groups. So one of the stories I tell in the book is of a woman called Kyla Posey, who's an African-American educator in the suburbs of Atlanta, who does some work with her school district and therefore has traditionally been allowed to pick a teacher for her students. It's kind of the standard deal there. And so she asked the principal of her elementary school whether she would be allowed to do that. And the principal said, sure, of course, send over the name of a teacher. But when she did, the principal kept demurring, kept sort of saying, well, can't you find a different teacher, or, you know, and finally she said, look, what's up here? Why aren't you letting me take my pick? And the principal responded, well, you know, that's not the black class. Now, this sounds like a, you know, old-fashioned, terrible story of racial segregation in the American South, until you learn that the principal of the school is a black woman who's deeply influenced by this form of progressive separatism in education, who's bought the idea that, you know, these kids must have a large number of same-race classmates in order to have a healthy racial identity. And so even for the parent in this case said, a different teacher is going to be right for my kid. I know my kid, I know these teachers, I prefer a different teacher. The principal said, no, you have to be in the black class. That starts to worry me. Another aspect of that worries me is what that does to white kids, right? So when you have these affinity groups where you have teachers come into schools with 6, 7, 8-year-olds, we're not talking about teenagers who make their own choices about a cultural club to belong to. We're talking about kids who don't have that much agency. And the teachers separate out those kids. What do you do with the white kids? When I was growing up as a Jew in Germany and was Protestant or Catholic religion class, I sort of ended up as the only Jew in the school with 2, you know, children of Turkish immigrants hanging out, not really doing anything and reading magazines together. It's quite pleasant. But that's not fair, right? You can't say the white kids get to have recess while all the others are being talked at, right? So what you do is a white group, and you're trying to inculcate in them as strongly as possible a self-identification as white. And the hope is that they're going to be great anti-racist activists, or they're going to become aware of white privilege. That is not historically how these things have worked out. The group with which we identify is quite malleable. But once somebody tells you, the main thing about you is that you're white, you're going to have an instinct to favor the in-group and discriminate against the out-group. That is something that humans have done in most situations. And so I think it's really a mistake for so many of our institutions to encourage people to lean into their identity as strongly as possible. Identities will always be a part of a diverse democracy, that's fine. But what our institutions should be doing is to teach people what we have in common and how we can cooperate, not to encourage and incentivize them to think of themselves as defined in the opposition to each other.